Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm a women's health dietitian and I'm recording a presentation for you all today about nutrition across the cycle. So some background about me. I am a dietitian living and working in Christchurch and I work at a clinic called Oxford Women's Health, which is a private gynecology clinic where women with multiple different hormonal and gynecological conditions come to see my colleagues and myself for support. I also founded the online platform to provide education, consultations, and speaking gigs like this called Your Monthly, with an ability to take the conversations that I have with women every day in clinic to a big audience. So super excited to be presenting to you guys. I'm sorry it's not live, but I'm more than happy to share my slides. So you've got a copy of those. And if you have questions, I'm sure those could be collated and sent through to me as well. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Please just make yourselves comfortable while I figure that out. And then we'll get into it. Hang on a second. Also, hopefully you guys can see that. Alrighty, so things that we're going to cover today is we're going to talk more about the female menstrual cycle and getting to know and understanding the different hormonal phases that occur for women who have a period, and zoom in on each phase and talk more specifically about what you can expect in terms of those hormones' influence on our psychology and our physiology, which I think is really interesting. We're also going to talk about common cycle complaints and period experiences and how some of those symptoms can be mediated through nutrition changes. And I'm also going to talk about tracking your cycle, how to get started, what to look for, and some of the apps you might find useful to use. So my mission statement when I work with females is to help empower them to understand that in a way, hormones are our superpower. And when you understand how they can work for us rather than against us, it kind of flips that dialogue around being hormonal being a negative thing. My little tagline is that fertility is so much more than just making babies. And I think historically women have kind of looked at having ovulation occur in their cycle and having a regular period is only necessary if you are wanting to fall pregnant. But we know that there's so many really important health benefits from having a healthy cycle. And we could consider it to be a sign of vitality and health, just like other systems in the body. So just to get some jargon and some science language out of the way before we spend some more time together talking about the cycle in particular, is you need to understand what a hormone is. So hormones could be thought of as cell messengers, or almost like, if we personify them, little guys that deliver messages throughout your body to turn on or off different processes. Hormone production always begins in a part of your brain called the hypothalamus, which is the control tower that talks to all the different hormone making glands that you have in your body. And there's hormones that are involved in nearly every process that we go through as a human being. So as an example, you've got your thyroid gland, which is around your neck, that makes thyroid hormone, which is important for metabolism and giving our cells access to energy. You've got your adrenal glands, which are the walnut-shaped glands that sit on top of your kidneys, which are involved in stress hormone production. You've got your pancreas, which makes hormones like insulin and glucagon, important for blood sugar regulation. And you've got your ovaries, which make sex hormones, and males have testes, which make sex hormones as well. So they're really important for us, and we're going to talk about them further today in the context of reproductive health. So if we look at a cycle as an overview, you can see it's quite complicated, and that there's lots of different rise and fall events of different hormones across our cycle. So this isn't an average cycle where a woman's experiencing a period, and there's some different things here I'll talk you through before you move forward. So a cycle length is defined as the first day of your period through to the next first day of your period. So you'll see here it says the average cycle length is 28 days, so 28 days between each period. But it would also be normal to have a cycle length of anywhere between 21 to 35 days, and only about 18% of females actually have a 28-day cycle. It's also really normal to have a little bit of variation from month to month because humans aren't perfect and we're not robots. So for example, if it's a plus or minus 2 to 3 days, that would be considered normal. So if you've had a 21-day cycle and then it's 23 or 24 and then back to 21, that wouldn't be of any concern. So remember that your ovulation and this whole cascade of hormones begins in your hypothalamus. And what happens each month is once you've begun your period, we're in quite a low hormonal phase, and then we get this beginning rise of the hormone estrogen, specifically estradiol in this case. And at the same time, you can see here by that purple line, another hormone called luteinizing hormone is starting to be produced by your pituitary gland. So these two hormones kind of egg each other on. So the more estrogen you produce, the more luteinizing hormone you produce, the more luteinizing hormone you produce, the more estrogen you produce. What's happening at this part of your cycle in the lead up to ovulation is estrogen is thickening your endometrium or your uterine lining, which is what will fall away as your period. But it's also stimulating the follicles on your ovaries, which contain your egg cells, to mature, to develop, and to ripen, if you think about it that way. And it's picking 1 or 2 dominant follicles to nurture. And when those follicles become the right size, which is 22 millimeters, you'll have the act of ovulation occur, which is that follicle rupturing and the egg being released down into the fallopian tube. In the midpoint of our cycle, when that ovulation event happens, you then begin to make the hormone progesterone in the second half of your cycle. And it's really important for females to understand you only make progesterone after the event of ovulation. So if you don't ovulate, you don't make progesterone. And that's because progesterone is literally made by a gland that's left behind at the crater site of ovulation. It's progesterone that's maintaining your uterine lining the second half of your cycle. So think about it like a glue. It's kind of holding your endometrium to the side. And that gland has a lifespan of about 2 weeks. So usually what happens is you get this dive in the hormone estrogen, you get this rise in the hormone progesterone. And after about 2 weeks, if you haven't fallen pregnant, you'll have this drop in progesterone because that gland is losing lifespan. And that decline in progesterone is the trigger signal to causing you to have a period, or that glue coming away and your uterine lining falling away. So if we kind of break down the different hormones and talk about their benefit, remember estrogen is dominant in the first half of your cycle. So between, your period beginning and the ovulation midpoint. I spoke before about it being responsible for developing the endometrium and for ovulation occurring. But in terms of our health as females, we know that it's really important for developing a bone mineral density and involved in bone remodeling throughout our lifespan. Females have a peak in our bone mineral density between the age of 21 to 23, which after that age, it's about maintaining our bone mineral density. So females who have had amenorrhea or a loss of period in their teenage years, from things like eating disorders or overexercising or the use of certain contraceptive methods, will often have low bone mineral density as adults, which increases their risk of things like osteoporosis and osteopenia. It's also involved in connective tissue regeneration. So we know that females are more at risk of things like injuries at certain points in their cycle when they don't have as much estrogen around. It's also involved in the immune system, our vaginal health due to its link with our vaginal bacterial health, and also glucose uptake. So what that means is our cells are more able to utilize glucose as a fuel source in that part of our cycle, the first half of your cycle, which means, and how that translates to things like exercise, is females tend to be able to run faster, to be more interested in exercise and lift heavier weights at that part of our cycle versus second half, which is interesting. And if you think about the idea of the hormone estrogen being around fertility and what that would feel like, it tends to have a big connection around things like libido and mood. So we tend to be a little bit more outgoing and chatty in this part of our cycle because we're more fertile. Once you have that decline in estrogen, remember that progesterone is then the star of the show in that second half called your luteal phase. And progesterone has its own unique and really important impacts on our health. So we know that it's responsible for having that cycle timing for us. So women who have a regular cycle usually have regular ovulation, and progesterone's the guy that's maintaining that uterine lining and therefore that regularity the second half. It's also really important for us around protecting us from things like cardiovascular disease as females. So if you look at our risk of heart disease at population data, our risk is significantly lower than males until we reach menopause. And when we no longer make sex hormones like we did in our 20s, 30s, and early 40s, our heart disease risk increases quite rapidly to be that of a male, which is really interesting. It also increases our body temperature, it increases our basal metabolic rate, but also our appetite. So not only do we want more calories in this part of our cycle, but we burn more. It's also thought to help with sleep and restoration of the central nervous system, and can also impact on our digestion as well as the body works to try and absorb more nutrients from food in case you are to fall pregnant. I think the most important thing to know about progesterone is its really impactful effect on our mental health. It helps us to utilize neurotransmitters that cross through into the brain to give us a sense of well-being. And it's the fall of progesterone right before your period that causes those PMS, irritability, and quite vulnerable, tearful feelings for a lot of women. What wasn't pictured in that graph I showed you with all the different hormone lines is females actually make a little bit of testosterone across the cycle. There's not so much of a rise and fall. So it's not a male sex hormone, it's just a sex hormone. Most of the testosterone that we make is converted into estrogen, but we still have some that circulates as testosterone. It's really important for our bone mineral density and our muscle mass as well, actually. And we know that it gives females a sense of concentration, energy, and motivation as well. So I want you to reflect on your own cycle. And I think some things that you might want to do some work around or show some curiosity to is knowing your normal length of your cycle. So are you aware of how often your period comes? Have you noticed any change in your cycle length over the last 6 to 12 months? Having a note around like the heaviness of your period. If you're somebody who uses period products like tampons or pads or moon cups or period cups, you can kind of note how many of those that you're using across your bleed days. Is your period really light or really heavy? Things like period underwear are a little bit trickier because it's hard to kind of note flow rates using products like that. What are your other symptoms across your cycle? Do you have pain, cramping, PMS, acne, tender breasts? Some of the things I was talking about, like change in appetite or bowel motion. Do you not have a period at all? Or do you potentially fall in the category of never having had a period? So it's not my job to tell you, a diagnosis that might come under some of those symptoms or experiences, but it's about kind of understanding your own normal when you're baseline, seeking support when you know it's not normal earlier rather than later, so you can reap the rewards of those superpower hormones. Just a note on contraception. So my kind of thoughts on contraception are that there's lots of different types that affect our bodies in different ways and they work in different ways. And I think it's just about understanding what it is that you're taking and how it impacts your cycle and using informed decision making around which form is the best for you. There's lots of different types. There's ones that are hormonal and there's ones that are non-hormonal. The other thing to note about contraception is choices like the oral contraceptive pill, whether it's the combined or a progesterone only, they tend to mask amenorrhea or loss of period because it gives you a pill bleed every month, which is really different to that ovulation and then fall of progesterone that causes a natural period. So in my clients who are quite athletic, I don't love when they're on the pill, particularly if it's not for contraception, if it's for things like regulating their period or preventing acne, because it removes the ability to kind of pick up on underfueling and that loss of period. Other different types of contraception, like the jab or Depo-Provera, has a known impact on our bone mineral density. So it's not often used anymore in younger females because of the impact. But just kind of some notes there to think about for yourselves. Cool. So I'm going to talk further now about the different cycle phases and how nutrition can play a role in each phase of the cycle. So if we think about that cycle, as I was talking about before, there's lots of different symptoms that you might experience. And I think it's worthwhile knowing how you can zoom in on those symptoms and tweak some things to have a better period experience. So if we start with a period itself, so obviously some of the common symptoms that women experience is pain and also cramping. I think it's important to know that pain that prevents you from participating in things like sports, it makes you kind of miss commitments like work, school, university, or at least consider missing, because I think a lot of people push through that pain and try and participate as best as they can because of responsibilities. If that pain wakes you up from your sleep, it causes vomiting and it's not relieved by over-the-counter pain relief, that's definitely not normal, and you should go and speak with your GP about what could be happening for you in your body. Cramping is definitely normal, and everyone has different pain tolerances. So some cramping for some women in their period can be quite intense, and others it's not really noticeable. The cramping itself is caused by something called prostaglandins, which is it's not a hormone, but for the sake of today, we'll call it a hormone, which causes your smooth muscle to contract, which affects not only your uterus cramping, but it can also cause bowel cramping as well. Because of that, lots of women will experience a change in their bowel habits around their period, usually feeling more bloated and needing to go to the toilet a lot more urgently. And in terms of how someone feels, it's usually sense of fatigue here. It's a really low hormonal phase, so females can tend to feel a little bit flat as well. So if we're trying to manage period cramps with nutrition and lifestyle, I think the first thing to note is the impact that cortisol, which is a stress hormone, has on pain. So a lot of my clients will talk about when they're more stressed, the period seems to be more painful, and there's science behind that. So cortisol being a stress hormone increases your sensitivity to pain. So you don't have to go on holiday every time you've got your period, but kind of being aware if it is more painful versus last cycle, just kind of taking note what's happening for you in terms of your mental well-being that month. Movement is the last thing we often feel like when we have our period, but even like gentle yoga, walking, anything that kind of fills your emotional cup up is really important in a natural pain relief. And there's also some evidence that omega-3 can reduce those prostaglandins, either through the diet or supplementation to help with that pain as well. So think oily fish, avocados, chia seeds, olive oil, etc. But I usually recommend a supplement to my clients. In terms of managing those digestion changes, avoiding your personal common triggers. So everyone knows the foods that kind of set them off. For me, it's things like lots of lentils and pulses or really rich pastas, etc. So if you know there's some certain foods that cause you stomach upset, you could minimize them more intensively at this part of your cycle. Other common triggers to be mindful of is highly fermentable fruits and vegetables. So things like apples, pears, and stone fruits, and onion and garlic are really common as well. Being mindful of increasing your soluble fiber to help bulk up your bowel motions and reduce your urgency. So things like psyllium husk is really useful there, bananas and oats as well. In terms of your energy levels at this part of your cycle, just honoring that rest is actually completely fine. You don't have to do it at all, like at 100% every day of your cycle. And if you learn to track your cycle, you can pay attention to that a little bit more. This is a kind of some further, I'm just going to leave that slide up there for a second for you to look at it because I've spoken about a little bit of it already. But there's some common things that can cause bowel disturbances, and it just increases your sensitivity when you have those prostaglandins around at that part of your cycle. So in terms of heavy periods, there's minimal evidence that nutrition can make a difference, and often heavy periods are either genetic, they could be due to the size of your uterus. So if you've got a bigger uterus, then you're going to have a bigger endometrium or uterine lining and therefore a heavier period, and that often happens to women after they've had children because your uterus never quite goes back to the size it was before babies. It can be due to things like blood clot disorders or conditions like adenomyosis or endometriosis. Some contraception choices like the copper intrauterine device or IUD can also cause an increase in your flow by 20 to 30%. Iron deficiency can interestingly cause heavy periods, and also obviously the heavy period can then go on to cause iron deficiency. And there's a little bit of evidence that the A1 casein in milk might cause a histamine response in the uterus and therefore a heavier period. So if you've been investigated for some of the conditions I've already been speaking about and it hasn't worked, or there's nothing there medical to note, then you could trial a dairy-free diet for a couple of cycles to see if it makes a difference. And interestingly, ibuprofen has been shown to lighten periods by up to 50%. So I think it's safe to take. If you can kind of check with your pharmacist if you're on any other medications, that there's no interaction there, it's safe to take for the heavier bleed days if that's something you would find helpful. So after your period phase, we have the ovulation phase. So things that you'll notice there is because of that spike in estrogen and its ability to increase our glucose uptake from the foods that we eat, you often will see your appetite reduce, which is interesting to note. Your ability to store glycogen is improved as well. So if you are an active person and you're carbohydrate loading for a race, you're more primed to do that at this part of your cycle. managing your nutrition here is around if you are really active and you're trying to work on eating for your training and not just being led by appetite is really important. So things like having smoothies post-exercise can be really useful if you're not really hungry, but you know that you need to eat. It's usually quite tempting to have something really refreshing like a smoothie where you can get lots of carbohydrates, protein, and fluid in there, which is also interesting. And the next part of your cycle being your luteal phase. So remember, you've had your period phase, your follicular phase leading to ovulation, and now we're talking about the part of your cycle that's leading up to your period. So because your appetite increases, your metabolic rate is also increased as well, which we're going to come back to talking about. If you are an exerciser, you'll notice that progesterone changes your heat tolerance as well. So you might sweat more when you're exercising, which is important to think about in terms of fluid replacing and electrolytes. And the biggest thing that I talk about with clients here is that digestion change. So a problem with bloating is really common. Constipation can flare up as well. And that's because your progesterone levels are slowing down your gut transit time. So how long it takes for food to move through your system. So your body can absorb the nutrients from food, priming you for pregnancy. So here it's around increasing appetite, matching it with food. I think a lot of females fall into this trap of prescribing nutrition, like they pack the same lunch every day. And they always kind of portion robotically the same dinner or maybe have the same breakfast without thinking of it. I think you need to plan to be hungry so you can think critically around what snacks are going to be helpful to have, what satisfies me, what's really high in protein to keep me full until the next meal, rather than being surprised by how hungry you are and being at the mercy of your food environment, which if you think about kind of being in a car and pulling over, trying to find something quick to eat, you're talking about what's available at a petrol station, a cafe, which is usually not a great choice. So I think you need to plan to be hungry at this part of your cycle. Pack afternoon tea, pack a really good lunch and eat like you mean it. If you're exercising at this part of your cycle and you're noticing an increase in your sweat rate, then I think changing the timing of your training to be away from hotter parts of the day can be useful. But really making sure that you're hydrated and including electrolytes, not just water, can be a useful tool. Some of the digestion changes I spoke about in that period phase, you can also combat through the same skill set at this part of your cycle as well. Just a kind of a separate note on PMS, which happens, remember, when you get that progesterone decline as you're heading towards your period. Some women are more symptomatic of that progesterone decline than others, and they go on to experience a variety of PMS type symptoms, and everybody's experience is really different. So that progesterone decline tends to upset our brain's ability to access that neurotransmitter GABA, which makes us feel really good. So often there with clients, I'll talk about this idea of an emotional first aid kit. If you know your period's coming at that part of your month and you've highlighted it in your app or your diary, you can do some critical thinking around, going to bed early, saying no to certain social things, pushing things to the week after or moving them to the week prior. Doing things that make you feel good just for you, I think, is really important, and don't minimize the impact they can have on your period experience. Magnesium supplementation can also be really helpful here as well, as it's used in the process of making hormones in the body. And there is some evidence that B6 supplementation can also help with your mood. A lot of women tend to crave sugar at this part of their cycle as well. I think part of that is like seeking things that make us feel good when we're feeling a little bit vulnerable. So things to combat that is to try and up your protein. So particularly that first half of the day, if you can front load your day with more protein, it tends to help with that sugar crash and experience of wanting sugar in the afternoon and in the evening. So some like easy things to add is things like protein powders. If you're having oats or smoothies for breakfast, purchasing higher protein yogurts can be a really good idea. Trying to aim for like a hand portion of protein at your main meals is really useful too. And if you're having an afternoon tea, I think include something sweet if that's a craving, but have a buddy system of increasing your protein in that same moment too. So something like a piece of baking or like a raw slice you've made to look forward to, but having it with something like that protein yogurt on the side is the perfect balance. Breast tenderness is also another really common PMS symptom. And there I would recommend iodine supplementation or looking at iodine-rich foods like seaweed, which can really help. One last note here on a specific nutrient, which I thought was relevant to talking about if you're talking about the cycle with females, which is iron deficiency. So iron deficiency is really prevalent. It affects an estimated 25 to 30% of females under the age of 35 in New Zealand in their lifetime. And iron's important because it has a role in our immune system. It's really important for growth in children and adolescents, and it helps us to deliver oxygen around our cells in our body. Iron attaches to hemoglobin and then oxygen, which is then delivered around via our bloodstream. So females at risk of iron deficiency because iron's attached to red blood cells. When you have a period, you're having an iron loss every month. But our increase in risk is also increased if you are plant-based, because the type of iron you get from plant-based foods is so poorly bioavailable to the body. So you only absorb about 15 to 20% of the iron from a plant-based food versus about 30% of the iron from red meat as an alternative. Athletes are also at risk of iron deficiency because you make hormones when you exercise, which stay in your system for 8 to 12 hours after the activity has ended, which inhibit iron absorption. So if you think about going to a CrossFit class at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're making the hormone hepcidin throughout the rest of your day, which will impact further on your body's ability to absorb iron. When you exercise, you also have sometimes like vascular bleeding at microscopic level, and that of course causes an increase in blood loss and iron deficiency as well. So our requirements as females is 18 milligrams of iron per day, and I tell my clients to double that target if you're plant-based to allow for that bioavailability difference. It's also really important to talk about the impact of tannins and vitamin C on iron absorption. So you can improve your iron absorption from meals by including iron-rich foods alongside a vitamin C-rich food. So for example, if you were having eggs on whole grain toast for breakfast, then having like a side of fruit or a smoothie with blueberries would hit the spot in terms of that vitamin C. If you're having a steak or a piece of fish or a piece of chicken or a tofu stir fry for dinner, then having some colorful vegetables like broccoli, capsicum, carrots, also really rich in vitamin C as well. There's no need to drink orange juice, which you see sometimes people doing to try and increase their vitamin C intake. Tannins inhibits iron absorption, and you find that phytocompound in things like coffee, tea, and red wine. So the advice there is to try and avoid having those type of beverages 30 minutes before or after an iron-rich food or a supplement. If you do go on to experience an iron deficiency, you have to treat the deficiency through supplementation. It's just too hard to correct with food. But having a diet rich in iron foods is really important for preventing that deficiency. And if you're at risk of iron deficiency, so maybe you're somebody who's really active, you're vegetarian or vegan, or you have a condition like endometriosis, which causes heavy periods, I recommend that you get your iron levels checked every 6 months by your GP so you can capture that decline in iron early and correct the deficiency or the risk of deficiency sooner. So the last part of my presentation is around how you can get to know your cycle. So going into this idea of tracking your cycle. So some of the apps that my clients use, some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for or upgrade to, but some of my favorites are Flow, Clue. If you have a smartwatch like a Garmin or an Apple or a Samsung watch, and they all have really good apps. There's also the health app on iPhones, which track cycles as well, and you have the ability to store data like symptoms. You kind of like rank your flow, your appetite, some of those things I was talking about earlier in the presentation. A good old pen and paper and a calendar also works. If you're kind of a visual person and you want to see it on a piece of paper, kind of kicking it old school. And as I mentioned before, I think as a beginning point, just trying to note things like your cycle length, what your flow is like, and your symptoms. I really think that this idea of championing your cycle is not necessarily living kind of at the limitation of where you're at in your cycle, but just showing yourself a bit of self-compassion. Exercise is going to feel better the first half of your cycle than it is the second. It's really normal that you're feeling hungry, you know, on day 20 to day 30. It's really normal that you're feeling flat and not wanting to socialize around the time of your period and kind of going inward and thinking about this idea of resting and nurturing yourself. I think when you can kind of pay attention to the ebb and flow that makes us unique in terms of female physiology and those hormones, it can be really empowering. So I just invite you to spend some time thinking about that. So that was a beginning information session on the female cycle and what you might find interesting. You can learn more about the work that I do, work with me and get in contact by going to my website, which is yourmonthlyclub.co.nz. You could research my clinic at Oxford Women's Health here in Christchurch, and you can follow me on Instagram at yourmonthly. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you found it useful. I'm going to stop sharing now and end our recording. Ka kite.